Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming on this lovely afternoon, this lovely Washington spring afternoon. My name is David Viorst. I'm the Executive Director of the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Internet Society, and we'd like to thank Ari Schwartz and Bree Law and everybody at Venable for putting on this great event. Ari will be introducing the panelists shortly. This is quite an important topic, and we felt it would be important to take kind of a more forward, vital look at it that other people aren't looking at. I'd like to thank our council member, Steve Miller, for helping to put this together. And I'd like to encourage everybody to get more involved with ISOC-DC. If you care about the issues facing the future of the internet, you can find us online at isoc-dc.org. We're also involved in the planning for the IGF USA. That can be found online as well. You can ask me or Steve questions after the event. Thank you for coming. Enjoy the event. And grab a lunch outside. They're pretty good.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, David. We have mics here, but
Sure.
so here's your incentive. We're going to be talking about incentives today. Here's your incentive, reverse incentive to come forward, which is that these mics aren't to project sound. They are for the video. So the people in the back of the room are going to have a much better time hearing us closer up. So sorry about that, but it does give you the incentive to move forward. Meanwhile, we will speak loudly. I'll speak up here. We're going to go in an order today. So we have 3 great panelists today. Really happy with how this turned out and the folks we were able to get to come today. Our first speaker, I'm going to introduce them before they speak. They're going to give opening introductory remarks. They come from very different places in the ecosystem, in the cybersecurity risk management ecosystem here. So I'm going to introduce them each individually, and then from there let them talk for 5-7 minutes, and then move on to the next panelist. So the first is Olaf Kolkman. He's the Chief Internet Technology Officer at the Internet Society. We were fortunate that he happened to be in town as we were putting the dates together for this, and so we chose this date partially around his schedule. So glad that he could was able to attend. He has been responsible for leading the Internet Society's strategic technical activities, particularly as they pertain to issues and opportunities for enhancing the Internet evolution. Olaf has been actively involved with Internet technology since his astronomy studies during the early 90s. The Internet became his professional focus in 1996 when he joined RIPE NCC to develop the first of what has become worldwide test network. In 2007, he became the managing director for NL Net Labs. Under his responsibility, NL Net Labs produced the open source products, performed research on technical issues with global impact, and contributed actively to the regional and global collaborative standard and governance bodies, including ICANN, RIPE, and IETF, and he pushed the needle forward on development and deployment of DNSSEC. He described himself as an Internet generalist and an evangeneer, someone with deep knowledge and Internet technical aspects, particularly enjoys bridging the technology and policy gaps, which makes him a perfect speaker for this panel. Thanks. Olaf.
Oh, I thought you were going to introduce everybody first.
No. I'm going to introduce each person individually.
Perfect. So, yeah, my background is I come from the internet world. So when I think about risks, I think about the systemic risks of the internet. Coincidentally, we've just published a survey, or we didn't, CIGI and Ipsos just published a service at which we collaborated, where 24,000 users, a little over 24,000 users were surveyed around the trust in the internet. And on the question whether you overall whether they overall trust the internet, only 12% strongly agreed, and 43% agreed somewhat. And I think that is a risk. I think that the lack of trust in the internet is something that that is a risk. And we've been thinking about the incentives to create better security on the internet. Let me give an example. Usually, when you think about security, you think about it in a fortress type of way. You think about, how do I put up the walls? How do I put up the gates? How do I make sure that the bad, evil world doesn't come in? That is a thing which you have under control. The risk management around that is under your control. You have a fairly good idea about your assets. You have a fairly good idea about your control, your available controls, and so on and so forth. But there's also another aspect. If in the internet, if you have a device that is connected to the internet, it can be used as an attack vector against that internet. It can be used as a stepping stone for further attacks elsewhere, and it can be used, for instance, as part of a botnet, which is I assume everybody knows what a botnet is, but it's a series of connected hosts that have been taken over and direct a bunch of traffic to one single place, basically cutting off a section of the internet or a specific a company. There is a responsibility to make sure that whatever is in your area of control doesn't impact the rest of the internet. But all those risks are completely externalized. So if we think about securing that piece of the internet, then to me the questions come in. How do we create a sense of responsibility whereby the externalized factors, how does my security stance impact the rest of the internet? How do you incentivize that? This is particularly important in the context of Internet of Things. We're shipping devices, hundreds of millions today in the consumer market. And we've already seen that some of these devices are configured in a bad way. This is not new. It used to be the case that we had modems, the ordinary modems that had an interface with default passwords. Now it's security cameras that come with default passwords, or with not very well patched security vulnerabilities. And this is a thing that is happening today. Companies that were traditionally not in the business of doing internet security or even computer security have now become computer and ICT companies. If you were making dolls previously, now you're making connected dolls. If you were making fridges, now you're making connected fridges. And so all companies are slowly becoming IT companies, and all these companies have a responsibility, perhaps without even knowing this. My biggest question around incentivizing and risk is in that area. When we talk about risk here, I think we mostly look at inwards risks. What happens if data is breached? That is also important for the trust in the internet, obviously. But my question is, how do we incentivize the rest? So that is sort of my question here to the panel and to the audience, I guess. And with that, I'm going to hand back
Great.
to the model.
Okay. Next we have Aarti Soni. Aarti is the cyber claims advocacy leader for the professional liability network security and privacy practice of Marsh in New York, New York. Aarti joined Marsh in July 2016. Before that, she was at AIG, where she worked. She also worked before that as an associate at two national law firms. And she also was assistant general counsel at Chubb, where she was a member of the cyber product board there. And she also got her both her undergraduate and law degree at American University, right around the corner. So she's familiar with Washington, D.C. as well. We're excited to have Aarti here because in all of these panels, insurance always comes up. So we can turn to the real experts in the room for the brokers in the space. So go ahead.
Thank you, Aarti. It's great to be here. I wanted to give you a little bit of background in cyber insurance without boring you to tears, but I think it's important because cyber insurance has become a major player in the risk transfer market for cyber. So cyber policies were born out of technology E&O policies, and E&O is errors and omissions. So maybe 15 years ago, technology companies saw a risk for exposure that, their systems could be, their computer systems could be infiltrated somehow. In the market, what we did is 15 to 20 years ago, we took traditional errors and omissions, professional liability coverage, and then took traditional property coverages and merged them together to be a cyber policy. So you have a first-party element to it and a third-party element. We've seen a huge shift in thinking in the last couple of years, and at every conference involving cybersecurity, this comes up, and I always say it when I speak, but we've seen this shift from the IT to the boardroom or the C-suite, and I can tell you that that's been very demonstrable in my less than 1 year at Marsh. I've had colleagues who are on the property or D&O side, and they tell me every year they go to a prospect to, try to sell cyber insurance, and they were just meeting with an IT or risk manager, and now they ask me to come and present in front of boards because this issue, for several reasons, you see a lot of incidents in the media. That's huge. And what happens, I can tell you from working at an insurance company and a broker, is the minute a breach happens or a hack, anything that's newsworthy, everybody calls and says, is it covered? Is it covered under my policy? Do I need to get it covered under my policy? So we just sort of have to stay on top of those things. Another thing is vendor contracts are requiring cyber insurance in many cases. So in business-to-business transactions, the way you see general liability or workers' comp, even though there's not a great understanding of cyber insurance or the kinds of limits that are appropriate, people are still requiring it in contracts. We've seen in the cyber market double-digit growth almost every quarter. Even in the first quarter of this year, we've seen a 25% growth, which I don't think there's any other line of insurance can say that. And again, I think it's based on some of these factors that there's such a trend in the industry. And I think also there's just so many commercials. We were speaking earlier that now cyber is spreading from large businesses to small businesses. Cyber insurance is also now available for high net worth individuals, and it's now we have enough information and we have enough data about how it functions to be able to shape it and make it more malleable and fit, customize it. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the application evolution. So a few years ago, you would see an application for a cyber policy, and it's like, do you use Windows 96, right? It was like basically sort of trivial, and it was something that wasn't considered. Now applications are more aligned with the NIST framework. Marsh, we have our own assessment that we've designed. We've gone to all the carriers and we've said, is it okay if the prospect or the client just fills out our assessment and you use it? And we ask a lot of detailed questions. And I think that evolution is important in understanding the risk. So how it works is insurers ask for applications, and the broker will help you decide, who the best potential insurance markets are for you based on industry, industry class, size, a number of factors. And you may have special factors as a company. And then what the brokers do is we look at what the top few markets are for you and pricing and things like that. There are about 15 insurers that offer primary policies, which means that they'll write the wording and they'll take on usually the big chunk of the potential liability. But in the 10 months that I've been at Marsh, I've seen 6 new forms. What that means is players that were traditionally in the excess market are now moving to primary. What it means is more players are trying to get into the game. One of the things I do is I draft and evaluate coverages, and I'll tell you that most of these new forms have 2 or 3, shiny aspects to them to make them stand out. Most of the forms generally are pretty comparable, and what I do is I try to warehouse the best in class for Marsh clients to be able to, get the best from all those forms. But it's interesting that you see evolutions, you see new coverages, and I think some of them will probably come out in our discussion today. The other thing you see that I think insurance companies are getting right, which is relatively new, is hiring the right people. hiring technology people, not just insurance experts and lawyers. And that's been a huge shift. I worked at Ace Chubb before, and we actually hired, when I was on the cyber team there, we actually hired the enterprise risk management head cyber lead and brought him into our products department just to help us be conversant, in the technology aspects. So I spoke a little bit about underwriters. So what underwriters do is they look at the assessments or applications, and then they place, they decide what the premium is, and then the prospect or the client decides, which carrier they'll go with. Like I said, there's a lot of movement in insurance coverages. The average insurance policy probably has a shelf life of, a year, 18 months, 2 years before it's manuscripted so heavily. And again, that's sort of based on what's happening. I don't want to say the insurance industry is reactionary, but to some degree, when you have clients asking, what do I really have here? Is it going to cover what was on the news last night? You can't really say no. The other thing that insurance companies do when you see an event is, because there is so much discussion, is this supposed to be covered under our policy? You'll see either in the next, iteration of their policy, they'll either be affirmative coverage or an exclusion. So that's very commonplace. That I know it happened when I was drafting policies, that all of a sudden we're like, do we have a False Claims Act exclusion? That's not intended to be covered, which may have been ambiguous in the policy. So in that way, there is a reactionary force going on. And the other thing I wanted to mention is loss mitigation. So the other trend I'd say in the last 5 years has been, for every day there are new cyber vendors entering the market, and carriers are pairing with these or partnering with these. And some of them, what they do is they offer like a buffet of services, have somebody come in and, phish your employees, or have somebody come in and benchmark, all these different things. And they'll basically, it makes you a better cyber risk, right? So it makes you healthier. It's like wearing a Fitbit and, your insurance company tracking that. It's the same sort of thing, right? It's testing your cyber fitness. So these partnerships have been very successful, because basically you can pick from, a wide array of services for $2,000 or $3,000, and depending on how large the company is, if that can somehow translate into you getting a reduction in premium, we're talking like a big savings. So that's, we're speaking of incentives. So that's some incentivization, I guess, that we've seen in the cyber insurance industry.
Thanks, Aarti. That's great. We'll have lots of questions for you coming back, because you raised about a dozen different issues there for people to think about. So last, but certainly not least, is Tom Gann, who's the Chief Public Policy Officer at McAfee. As many of you know, it doesn't say this in the bio, but McAfee has recently split back off of Intel, from Intel. So now Tom is the Chief Public Policy Officer for the newly spun off McAfee. In this capacity, he manages U.S. and international advocacy activities and partners with the public relations team to help position McAfee as an industry leader in capitals around the world. Prior to joining McAfee, Gann managed cybersecurity policy, government relations, alliances, product marketing, and sales functions at Intel, Sun Microsystems, Siebel Systems, and Digimarc. He started his career on Capitol Hill working as legislative director and chief of staff to Congressman Tom Campbell from the great state of California. It doesn't say that in here, but I added the California part because I know Californians out there. And Gann, and he has a master in management from the London Business School. Tom, go ahead.
Well, thanks, Aarti. The big thing to say, it's always a pleasure to be here on a panel with such distinguished colleagues, and it's always a pleasure to be here with Aarti, an old friend. At McAfee and Intel, we've thought a lot about cybersecurity incentives for a good long time. The matter of incentives pops up in so many ways. It pops up on a grand scale, whether in the insurance market. It pops up in public policy circles on the question of, should one regulate or should one put in place positive incentives to create the right kind of cyber behavior. And we see it every day with our customers, whether corporate customers, government customers, or even smaller consumer customers. The issue of incentives really is part and parcel of our business. It's for that reason that we, earlier in the year, worked with the Center for Strategic and International Studies and helped support some very unique research that that think tank did. Their research focused in on the question of how misaligned incentives work against cybersecurity. And indeed, a very fine report was issued by that research group. And it really looked at a more narrow question in the area of cybersecurity incentives. It looked at the incentive structure for IT decision makers in organizations from top to bottom. So the chief executive officer, C-suite, all the way down, most importantly, to the cybersecurity operators and skilled professionals that deal with cybersecurity on a daily basis. Now, CSIS really is a very fine think tank, and when they do studies, as you would expect, they focus in on being very substantive and data-driven. So toward that end, the researchers polled and interviewed some 800 respondents across the globe to get their feedback on cybersecurity best practices, risks, and incentives in particular. The research was conducted in the US, the UK, Germany, Brazil, Japan, Singapore, Australia, and Mexico. And what was so interesting about it was that we saw divergent points of view on incentive structures from the top of an organization to the middle ranks down to the operator levels. What were the key findings? Well, there were significant misaligned incentives that were identified. The first one is there's a divergence on incentives between attackers and defenders. Attackers have very neatly coupled incentives. Their market is characterized by a highly fluid one. Information is exchanged quickly. Incentives are aligned quickly to able individuals from the top to the bottom of the attacker supply chain. On the other hand, in the defender market, too often we see middle management and, most importantly, cyber operators in environments that are highly bureaucratic with a lot of top-down management, and they're having to deal half the time just with their organizations and some of the challenges that lie within them. Strategy versus implementation. Some 90% of organizations that were polled at the top levels felt that they had a cybersecurity strategy that was working. But less than half of the actual operators who were working the problem day to day had confidence in those cybersecurity strategies. Executives versus implementers. Again, there was a gap. There was a gap, as just mentioned, on the perception of the degree to success of their cybersecurity strategies. But there was also a very different point of view on incentives, on motivations, on aligning such that strong cybersecurity health could be achieved from top to bottom. And I'll go into a lot more detail on these findings as we proceed. On the question of cybersecurity strategy, 93% of organizations report having a cybersecurity strategy, but in terms of the numbers, only 49% feel that the strategies have actually been implemented. Nearly 60% of IT executives believe that their cybersecurity strategies are sound, well thought out, and are being implemented. But of the implementers who actually deliver the services, who are protecting their organizations every day, only some 30% of the staff actually agree with their bosses. Now in Washington, we always take a great interest for sure in public policy and government agencies. According to the 800 respondents, the view was that governmental organizations were doing, broadly speaking, the least good job of actually implementing cybersecurity strategies and tactics. Now, some of the more interesting pieces of data that we culled from the research was the question of staff. You know, just like any battle, it's the privates, it's the sergeants, it's the corporals that win the battle day to day, particularly after strategy's been implemented. But in the context of a battle, confusion reigns, and it's your operators that make the most difference. Here we saw a profound impact on the differential types of incentives that exist between the attackers and the defenders. While cybersecurity criminals have a direct incentive for their work, the survey shows that there are few, if any, real incentives, according to the operators, for them to put their best foot forward and ensure the best protective environment possible for their organizations. 42% of implementers reported that, in their view, no real incentives existed for them to do their best job. That was compared to 18% of decision makers, and interestingly enough, 8% of leaders. So the higher you went in an organization, the higher degree of confidence there is in your strategy, the higher degree of confidence there is relative to incentives working. So what were some of the big takeaways of the study? You know, I think more than anything, there was a sense that there was a lot to be learned from the hacker environment, which seems to be very efficient, very fluid, and very effective in all respects. The first one was hackers leverage market forces. You know, the hacking community market is characterized by a highly decentralized model. Information flows quickly. Individuals are quickly assigned roles and compensated according to their abilities. In the private sector market, we've seen, at least based on this data set, that efficiency doesn't come to play very well. What can be done about it? The research suggested that it would be a good thing to look at security as a service. Organizations should think more about outsourcing, should think more about contracting out, particularly in governmental settings, such that more competition can be introduced and more players can be added into the mix. In the hacker market, there are very low barriers to entry. If you're smart, if you're capable, if you have gumption and skill in the hacking area, you can play. Too often in the private sector market, there are barriers to entry. There are requirements for degrees, advanced degrees, further training. The research suggested that while we need to invest more in broad-based cybersecurity training at the BA and master's level, we also need to do a lot more in the area of pop-up training, cyber camps, and other types of training that can bring in talented individuals who may not have the technical background in terms of formal degrees, but actually have the skill sets and gumption to pick up cyber skills rapidly. You know, and in conclusion, the big thing that the report suggested was the need to better align incentives. In the hacker environment, incentives are clear, crisp, people are rewarded, as was discussed earlier. In organizations, too often the incentives create gaps in terms of how leadership and operational players actually execute cyber. So as you might predict, the report suggested better aligning bonuses, stock, and other incentives to middle and operational people who are on the ground actually doing the work, and hold leadership much more accountable across the board. You know, in 5 or 7 minutes, it's hard to really summarize a piece of work of this kind. I'd urge you to take a look at the study on the CSIS website. And of course, as we go into Q&A, I'm happy to dig in deeper as appropriate. So again, thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Let me follow up with you, but we'll go back down the line on the question that Olaf asked to begin with, particularly around Internet of Things, which was, you know, the main topic that he was raising. You know, from the report, what incentives do you see as being able to address some of the big issues in Internet of Things, which, you know, is the cybersecurity problem magnified to a whole bunch of new sectors, right, and new problems in the space, and how do you see being able to align the incentives in the same type of way from the report to this new area?
Well, it's a very interesting question. You know, our CTO, Steve Groban, recently testified before the Senate Commerce Committee on the matter of IoT and security. The big point he made was that, look, manufacturers very often have the incentive to get new consumer products out as quickly as possible. Therefore, security sometimes can be an afterthought. So I think that his view was, and I'd concur on this, is that we need to do a better job of aligning incentives such that security and privacy are built in right from the beginning. We're not for regulation, but we do think that talking about some of the cybersecurity risks that are emerging in the Internet of Things as you go from, some number of billion of devices to, who knows, is it 5 billion devices that are connected at some point? That's a good start. In terms of the study, it didn't really look that precisely at the matter of IoT, but I think the organizational learnings on incentives can certainly be applied to large institutions that are delivering IoT devices.
Right. And following up on the point of view, some point that came up at the hearing that I'm wondering about from all three of you, Aarti mentioned the NIST framework, which I'm a big supporter of, and I think actually has moved the needle quite a bit in terms of giving us something to talk about across the range of sectors that have to deal with cybersecurity issues. For IoT, for the questions that Olaf raised, do we need another framework, or is the NIST framework on track to address IoT? In other words, that was something that came up at the hearing, basically saying we need another. A bunch of people said we need another framework that brings together all of the people that are in the IoT space to come up with something that has to do with managing IoT security, safety, and the issues in that space, separate from the framework that can relate back to the NIST framework, but is its own separate framework. How do people feel about that idea? Do we need something separate, or is it its own, or can we work within the NIST framework and make the NIST framework work?
Well, I think everything's going to feel like that, right? Like every new area is going to feel like somewhat of a departure. I think the NIST framework is really strong as it is, and it's going to have to be evolving. And I think that the IoT space will just evolve from that. From our perspective, from the insurance perspective, manufacturers have been really disappointed, I think, overall in the type of insurance coverage, available to them because of, issues like IoT that haven't really been contemplated. And I think really just, on the front end for them when they're developing products like this, to understand what their exposures are, whether they have insurance or don't. I think that's a really important element that may have been missing here.
We've been strong supporters of the NIST framework. What we've liked about it so much is the true public-private partnership, the fact that it's been voluntary, the fact that it's been so flexible. It's really at its core a maturity model. We think that core framework can be further evolved, further adopted to deal with IoT moving forward. And, I think that's been certainly an area of discussion over at NIST, and we have great confidence that progress can be made there.
Olaf, do you have thoughts on?
Yeah, I have some thoughts. There are currently, I think, I haven't done the count recently, but about 17 frameworks for IoT security and privacy.
Well, but there were, 100 cybersecurity ones, and the idea was the framework one.
Fair enough.
The
Fair
framework
enough.
pulled them together, right?
I think that when it comes to this type of norm development, because that's basically what we're trying to do collectively, we're trying to set a bunch of norms for which we say this is what we expect of each other. There are several incentive structures. What is the reason for a organization that ships IoT devices in the consumer market to apply the NIST framework? I don't know. One of the things that I've seen happening in the U.S. is that the Consumer Reports, for instance, are working on a IoT framework with security and privacy requirements, so to speak. That might be the right group to incentivize the consumer market. It might not be the right group to incentivize industrial IoT or smart grid IoT or what have you.
Yeah.
But I think that if you look at IoT, we usually talk about IoT as it being one thing. Obviously, it's not.
Yeah.
So I think you have to look at the area of application What groups do you need to incentivize? And how do you do that on a global scale? Because most of these products will come from elsewhere.
Points. So let's follow up on that, on the insurance point, right? Aarti, you said that insurance has a tendency to be somewhat reactive in this space, and it's one of the criticisms of people that hold up insurance to say that, the two big criticisms are, and you address both of them briefly. One of them is that you're not getting to the people that are actually performing the security, right? It's staying at this level of people that buy insurance and not getting deeper down. And you were saying that's changing because now boards and leadership are getting involved in security, so therefore there is a tie. But the second point, I think, is something that I know you've been working on, which is how do we get to move from being so reactive, so that I remember hearing from one of your colleagues directly, actually, that after the Target breach, a retailer couldn't get insurance unless they were encrypting from point of sale, right? It goes down to that level of granularity, right? Like, it's not you're doing what you're doing. It's all the insurers cared about was, are you encrypting the point of sale, and the other controls didn't really matter as much. So what can we do now to get IoT and some of those other issues that we know are on the horizon, but aren't quite hitting everyone every day yet, the way point of sale hacks were 2 years ago, to come up in this stream, so that insurance can become a better incentive in this space?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think one of the things we're doing is just listening to our clients, and it's akin to property insurance or something else, where you wouldn't insure one half of your house and not the second floor. So when clients come to us, a lot of what we do at Marsh is I sit with the property and casualty and other lines of coverage. I sit with the brokers and the lawyers and the wordings people. And it actually sounds like a lot of fun, and sometimes it can be. We come up with scenarios, and then we say, who's covering this? Who's covering this? And then we look for gaps and overlaps, and then we go industry by industry. And then when we have a manufacturing client in front of us, and they say, where is this covered? We have an answer, and we also find the gaps. And then when we find the gaps, part of my role is to draft an endorsement that fills the gap. But because we're a broker and not an insurance company, we can't financially back it up. So then we go to the markets. We go to the top, insurer markets and say, will you support this? We've just done this recently. Again, it deals with manufacturers, and we're doing it in two areas. The first is a supply chain. Our manufacturing clients want to know, well, I know if I have a hack, it's covered. What if I make greeting cards and my paper provider has a hack? This is traditional business interruption. The cyber market has taken the property traditional business interruption, which is much more advantageous to clients, and sort of tweaked it in a way that's less favorable. And so what we're doing is we're taking it back, and we've seen a couple of markets supporting this and doing this on their own. The second area is IoT, which is when clients are saying, well, all I do is develop this product, and it's an IoT risk. Where is it covered? It's not covered right now. So again, we're drafting a policy to do that, and you'll see this. Yes.
Most of those IoT manufacturers start out with the idea of developing a product, and then realize the data that comes out of that product is more valuable to them than the actual product, and that becomes the product. That's the transition into data companies. Are you working with some of those entities to understand whether the people you have in front of them are thinking about the data as well?
So
Questions going forward.
oh, so
Actually, Bree, can you grab the mic? 'Cause, this man in the purple shirt over there had his hand up too.
So to answer your question, when we just drafted a Marsh proprietary form, and one of the things we did is we made the business interruption look more like property. So the IoT form that we're working on looks like a products form. That's the look and feel, and we're working with our casualty team to make it pick up the first party and third party coverages that are, when we put all the policies overlapping, where we see those gaps. And the other thing is, I think if you're an IoT manufacturer, and I see this with every line of business, you want to see the words, right? So the definition I have of product in that policy is Internet of Things product, right? No ambiguity. They want to see the terms of art written in the policy. So that's an important aspect as well.
Can I go back to the business interruption piece? Because I see this a lot with our clients too. You know, it seems like the insurance companies basically say, but we have no way to assess our potential risk for business interruption in this space. What do you say back to them as a broker in this space to try and get your clients coverage when folks say that, right?
So there are two aspects to business interruption, the financial aspects, business income loss, and then extra expenses to keep your business going, expenses but for the interruption, right? And then the income loss. So one of the things that we've added, and again, this is done in a traditional property environment, is we've made the income loss something that you have to bring in a forensic accountant, and they'll look at, what did you make last January? And, they look at all your income statements and, they're making an estimation, but it's not out of nowhere. They're forensic accountants. And that cost to provide that, to have a proof of loss as documentation for the insurer is a covered cost to determine that. Currently, it is not. Maybe one or two carriers. We're trying to, I always do this because I call it like my moving the market endorsements. We're trying to get that to be a covered cost. So the entire business interruption experience is then covered, because I'll tell you from the time that I've been at Marsh, this is what the clients ask about all the time is business interruption. They feel like from a breach or hacking perspective that the insurance industry sort of has it down. You have a breach, the coach will call you in 10 minutes and these 10 things will happen right away. The idea of being down, of their systems being down, seems to be, much more concerning to them.
Regarding Internet of Things devices, when we're talking about liability, how do we determine who that falls on as far as insurance or even holding accountable? So the manufacturer or the consumer, for example, how does the consumer update the firmware on their refrigerator or whatever? So even if there is a solution in place, how do you determine where the responsibility falls on?
Yeah, so I think what we're going to see at first is, when we start to see more lawsuits come out, they're sort of naturally going to be targeted towards the manufacturers, and they don't have necessarily a protection in place to even defend them in these lawsuits. And that's, I think, the first step until we see, like I said, we try not to be reactionary, but until we see more, the way coverage works, right? It's defense to defend the claim, and then indemnity, which are actual damages. And they may not be able to prove actual damages, but they may be, like a strict liability, that could be an outcome, and that will be, court determinative. But at least we should have policies that can defend manufacturers through the process, or at least as an industry, we're working on that.
I find the DDoS examples the case is really interesting here in the liability sense, because the person who owns a device that is actually attacking others has basically no incentive to clean it up. Right? They first of all, they have no incentive to find out that their machine, their fridge or
not even the ability.
Video camera.
Not even the ability.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. This is a topic close to my heart. I think you're right. If your fridge is attacked or hacked and it spoils the food, and your grandmother gets, very sick because of a spoiled food, then there might be a liability route. But at the moment your fridge is hacked and it's attacking others, how does that work? And how do you get that all the way back into the supply chain, where in fact I think that most of these devices will run a Linux kernel, which is completely open source and has all the liability waivers. The question is, if you go down that route, will you, for instance, impact the ability of the development of open software? I think that there are very interesting questions coming up in that dynamic. So at some point, I think manufacturers have to have a number of live up to a number of expectations. Again, in the number of frameworks, the the OTA framework is one that basically describes that. What is your expectation? What do you need to do when you build a device like that? Software upgradability, making sure that you have the basic security functions in there. And perhaps if that type of frameworks become the norm, then we might see liability be projected, because that's once that is a norm, you can say, you should have known better.
And Tom, you see, there's been a lot of talk on the Hill about legislation in this space. How are you feeling about legislation and some of the legislation moving forward, or the ideas about legislation moving forward?
So I think there needs to be a great deal of care in the policy domain when it comes to IoT security. There can be at times a great instinct just to regulate. What we see with our customers is that a good number of them, particularly the corporate and enterprise customers, already in highly regulated environments, whether in energy, finance, what have you. Too often you get a check-the-box mentality where our customers are simply trying to meet the requirements of the regulation, check the boxes, and be done with it. We're then asked to assess how secure their organizations are after they've done these processes. And too often the bare minimum is done. It's enough to get through the regulator reviews, but not enough holistic thought is being given to strong security. That's why we like the NIST framework so much, because it's a more holistic, more maturity-based model approach where organizations, can pinpoint their security today and where they need to go. So thus, in the IoT market, much of this is developing. I would say that policymakers need to be very wary about mandating security because of the fear of a check-the-box approach. At the same time, I think the hearings, the focus on education, consumer awareness, adds a lot of value. And, we see great scope in the private market for such things like consumer reports to, over time, come out with reports like they do with cars on the matter of which IoT devices are, more secure versus less secure. So I think it's early. Let's see how the market develops before policymakers get too in love with regulation.
Yep, just two quick things. One thing is I used to work for the federal CIO and the federal CISO at the White House. And so my bosses worked with NIST to release a NIST publication. So I just wanted to share that with y'all on IoT standards. And that was Special Publication 800-160. And that was released in November. It's kind of lengthy. It's more than 200 pages. But I figured, it's something that relates to the discussion. And the other question I had was based on local governments, counties, things that y'all have seen in the insurance industry. Is there anyone that you can point to that is doing a good job at, like you said, the cyber fitness in terms of preparing themselves, testing, things like that folks at local governments can look to as an example?
So let me just raise also in the first place quick commercial, which is for NIST. NIST is hosting a workshop on the next version of the framework on the 16th and 17th of May. And on the 17th in the morning, it looks like they're going to have a panel on IoT and addressing, what's in 160 and what the future of the framework should be. So.
And on a similar note, one of the things that NIST is doing in that IoT space is looking at software upgradability. I think that is the type of gap analysis that they're involved in. Are there standards that allow for software upgradability? Because that's one of the technical things.
NTIA has a workshop on this
tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Yep.
And so let's answer the question now on local governments and tools for local governments. What's your local? Who's doing a good job working with local governments? And you want to?
Well. Happy to address that. At McAfee, we've got extensive relationships with state governments around the U.S., whether New York, whether California, Texas, they're all good customers. We see examples, particularly in the large states, where best practices are definitely being implemented and executed in it. This also brings us back to the question of the NIST framework. the NIST framework is being adopted on a voluntary basis by more and more states, which I think is a good thing. To create a synergy, a common language that the federal government can use when talking with states makes a lot of sense. One thing that we've also liked is Senator Warner bill that was recently introduced that puts in place a cybersecurity grants program at DHS for state and local government. And the idea is some percentage of the DHS grants should henceforth be used for cyber. While cyber is an allowable use at DHS, too often the funds are used in other areas, and some percentage, some appropriate percentage, I think, would be justified to tap those grant pools for states to improve their security, and then using the NIST framework as a guideline, I think can up the ante for states that are lagging behind some of their leading state colleagues.
Let me say, I mean, in the work that when I was at NSC, we followed states really closely, and I would say the states are all over the map, and as you said, some of the larger states tend to be better, but they really are. There's a big mix there, and there is a multi-state ISAC, which is a good resource for states. I mean, it's designed for states. There are a lot of good resources for state and local governments out there. Most of the time, it's the fact that they don't have enough resources put to it, rather than on their side, rather than the available things for them to go to. I would say I'm more concerned about large universities. If you look at kind of the sectors and where the different sectors fall and the ratings of different sectors by different groups, those that do kind of outside pinging especially, they'll tell you that universities are way below every other sector. And I think the folks at the universities will tell you, and particularly the large state universities, but the private ones too, will tell you that there are not enough resources that the universities put towards it, considering the demands on the other side, which is they're supposed to both be open and doing, extensive research that lots of hackers might be interested in, and they have sensitive information on their side. So they're a big target, and yet they have very little resources to deal with it, and they're supposed to be open institutions at the same time. That's a big challenge. We'll let Lance follow up on it before we go to Steve.
Well, I was going to ask another question, but for those of you who don't know me, I'm Lance Hoffman from George Washington University, and I run a couple of cybersecurity programs there. I am not, thankfully, in the business of running the university's computing operations. That said, my question is, for that one in particular, where is the reward structure going to come from for universities? And indeed, we're in a dynamic situation here where universities are changing ever so slowly. Education is changing ever so slowly. We're seeing way more people getting educated and trained in other places other than universities. The comment was made earlier here today about, well, maybe you don't need a bachelor's to do this or that or the other thing. Absolutely. And the question is, where are the incentives going to come from? And especially if universities running, you think of a university running both big data centers and small research labs that are open to hacking and that sort of thing. What happens if the architecture changes? You look at the NIST framework or other frameworks, they're pretty much are assuming a lot of similar architectures. What if suddenly the architecture changes? I'll give you one example. Automobiles, the first seatbelts came in, the patent or something was on them in 1890 or something like that, but the first seatbelts didn't really appear. I think one was in 1950. They weren't really mandated till after Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed, and in the late 60s, early 70s, and that sort of thing. We can't wait 80 years to change here. So where are the reward structures coming from? Especially to push, universities are a great example because they're big research universities are slow moving, despite the, where do you go with that?
So, and let me just add on. I mean, we know universities have had breaches and there've been incidents, right? And they've been sued, and yet we still have these same issues. So I don't know how people feel about the incentives, both at universities and this. I think Olaf can answer this also. The broader question about the changing infrastructure.
Changing infrastructure, I think we have to work with what we have. I think it comes back to, changing infrastructure. I think we have to work with what we have. I think it comes back to how do you create a security mindset? How do you create professionals, the operators? How do you empower those operators to work with a security mindset in the environment that they're active in? And if that environment evolves and they have a security mindset, then they will evolve with it. If they work from a compliancy perspective, if they have a compliancy checkbox perspective, then that changing environment will not get you the security. And that's sort of a question that I actually have to you two. That difference between the C level and the operator level. I believe that real security comes from getting a security mindset, making sure that the people who do the work have the security mindset. Now that is, how do you reward that? Difficult question. Is insurance actually a good driver for that? And I recently heard Russ Thomas speak about this on a conference, and he wrote about this in a blog, the cyber insurance emperor has no clothes, for if you want to look this up. And basically his assertion is, if you want to create that culture, perhaps insurance is not your right driver, because that sort of drives to externalizing risk and doesn't drive a mindset. So I wonder.
I think a couple of things. I think this cybersecurity in general is so fast moving, and to an earlier point, insurance is always going to be a little bit behind. But as we see, when I worked at Ace Chubb as the counsel, and I drafted endorsements for all of the E&O lines, 80% of my work was privacy and digital technology. So the other policies were being endorsed here and there. All of the focus was every day I was endorsing policies, because every day, literally, something new was happening, and something that was a reach for, a client to ask for, or a broker to ask for, then became standard language. So I disagree that the insurance industry isn't doing its part. They've paid a lot of claims, but they're also we were talking about this earlier, there's so little data to work with, and that's a huge point. There's so little actuarial data, there's so little claims data that we literally, one of the things I do is I go to carriers and I'm like, can you give me 5 business interruption claims from manufacturers? I'm getting asked because we don't have data, we don't share data as well as we should. There are some data aggregators, Advisen, Ponemon Institute, Verizon, DBIR, where, Net Diligence, where people are starting, the whole concept of information sharing. It's so important for us, because without sharing it, without all of our carriers and brokers sharing our experiences to some degree, we can't really do any type of predictive modeling. We can't really analyze what the risks are. So I think the other thing about creating a culture, and I think this also goes to the university's point, because I've had the exact same experience, is there's a lot of reactivity there too. I've seen universities get breached once, not by cyber insurance, get breached again, not by cyber insurance, and then when it becomes untenable, then they buy it, right? When it becomes something that it's just better to have it, and they're doing the right thing. They're doing their own, retention versus transfer analysis, which is exactly what they should be doing. But I don't think, some companies have the resources, but everyone is moving so quickly, even in terms of updating technology. I have clients all the time that say, I thought I was PCI compliant. I don't think I am, but was I when I signed, the application? This comes up a lot too, because the needle's moving so quickly.
Yeah, I think if you talk about that changing environment, it's changing as we speak already in terms of evolution, not even in terms of new computing paradigms or network paradigms. So it's already difficult now, let alone if you get to new networking paradigms. Yeah?
Right. Yeah, I think that's the issue in insurance, but I think that's sort of the issue for all of us, right? Is like keeping up with that. And I think clients are so concerned. I mean, one of the things we talked about that I mentioned is, training. So for example, you've heard about the W-2 scams. It's something insurance is paid a lot of money on. So someone calls, the HR person in an organization Friday, 5 o'clock. They say, fax me all the, or scan, all the W-2s for your employees, and people do it. And people did it, and everyone paid for it, and now people are doing it again, even now. And so you can have the most up-to-date computer systems in the world, but if your employees don't know not to answer that call, then it doesn't matter, right? So those are the other things. I mean, I had prepared some slides, and one of them that I had showed your inside threats and your outside threats, and we have to address that. Most of the threat still comes from human error or human intentional behavior. And that's hard to insure against, right? Because we always say in our cyber group at Marsh, we always say, hurricanes don't get smarter every 2 years, right? So that's what we're dealing with as well.
Yeah. That's a good tweet.
I can't take ownership of it.
Steve was had a hand up for a long time. I don't know. Okay, you got it.
So obviously a number of different threads here. I would love to actually take your seatbelt one a little bit further. I mean, Volvo patented the three-point harness in 1959, which made seatbelts safe and actually gave the patent away to the industry, which is, a great lesson if you look at open source and the like. Nowadays, you look at NIST cyber framework, which I think is important to point out. You've been raising it quite a bit here. It's not intended to be taken verbatim. Just because compliance with the cyber framework does not mean that you're secure in any way. To your point about you can check the boxes, that doesn't get you to the secure point of view. That's why seeing the awareness level being risen as far as cyber governance, boards being aware of insurance and the risk management now from a holistic approach is so important. I do want to go very briefly back to Olaf's, one of your very first comments about do you trust the internet? I sometimes wonder whether there is a little bit of a faulty logic there. The internet simply being this thing that's out there, right? So do you trust your toaster? Well, maybe it's harder now just because your toaster is plugged into it. So can we get to a trustworthy internet, trustworthy network, without a trustworthy computing platform espoused by Ron Ross at NIST and others, just because that becomes the challenge in and of itself?
So trust is it's a social term, so to speak. The question is around this. Trust is a matter of walking on the street and knowing that there will not be a piano falling on your head, so to speak. That's a matter of trust. I think we need to get to an environment where there's a reasonable balance of security versus threat. And if you look at that survey that I pointed to, people don't trust the internet enough to do their business there now. People feel, let's see, I don't have that number written down, but there are a good number of people that do not feel comfortable to buy things online. That's a situation that we do not want to be in, I think, as a society. I think we want to be in a level where things operate on a scale where there's little threat. There's still threat, but it's all manageable. So that's what trust is about. If you then look at security, building in security, at the Internet Society, we look at this in different levels. Trusted networks. Trusted networks means there is no, you cannot trust the Internet. It's packets can drop from a CIA perspective, confidentiality, integrity, and authentication. It doesn't really work. But we want to make sure that packets go from one end to the other end in the Internet. Things like naming and addressing and routing come into play there. You need that. Then, if you look at the internet as a system, you have these end systems, and I want to talk to you, but I don't know who you are. How can I trust you? What are the things that on global scale make that happen? Think of PKI, and also think about transport layer encryption. Think about the encryption to give us the privacy. And then you have the user trust. How does the activity or inactivity of individual users or entities or hosts or Internet of things that connect to the Internet impact the trust on the Internet, and how does the Internet impact the trust in these environments? And I think that is what we're now talking about. How do you make sure that the behavior of these entities at the edge is such that they don't impact the trust of the Internet, because data breaches get less, because every time there's a data breach in the news, people go like, for good reasons, by the way. How do you make that environment better? But also, how do you make sure that those individual actors that don't deploy a virus scanner and therefore get a botnet infection don't impact the rest of the Internet, whereby you get DOS attacks? So, complex environment, I would say. Whether you need a full trusted computing stack in order to solve that, I think that ship has sailed.
I mean, let me come at trust a different way than to pass it on to Tom, which is, it used to be that security companies would have to dig up the worst case scenario stories to get people's attention to cybersecurity. I mean, and it's not an exaggeration. I mean, now all you have to do is look at the front page news. I mean, it's not right. It's all right in front of us. It's all out there. You don't have to scare people. People are already scared.
I think
right?
that is,
and that's what getting back to trust is that balancing point. I don't know, Tom, if you have more to. You've been in the industry that whole stretch. So I don't know if you have more thoughts on that. Getting to that point back of equilibrium where there is trust.
So I think when McAfee was founded some 25 years ago, the big issue was dealing with one or two known viruses, right? Within viruses, I think viruses every day, at our labs. So as the virus landscape and attack vectors has increased, as the sophistication of attackers, going from hobbyists to criminal organizations to nation states, has expanded. I think at the same time, public awareness has changed. The target attack, any number of attacks have been front page news. I think the challenge today for the security industry is no longer the matter of awareness. I think it's the matter of keeping up with the hackers. What we see is an innovation curve where a new point-to-point solution is brought to the market, oftentimes at the edge, innovative companies, small companies. That solution can work for a period of time. An example would be sandboxing. That was all the rage for a few years. Then what happens is the attackers are out innovating too, and they're developing new attack vectors that can get around those new defenses. And then you see the utility of that solution starting to decline. And then there's a need for more innovation. So I think where we're going as an industry, our big argument at McAfee is we need to continue the innovation. We need to continue driving point-to-point solutions. But where we're putting most of our focus is on interoperability, creating environments where we can bring in for our customers any number of point solutions from any number of vendors in a very open interface kind of environment so that our customers can innovate progressively, hopefully as fast and eventually faster than attackers. But make no mistake about it, for maybe the next 10 years, we see the advantage being on the attacker side for many of the reasons we've discussed today.
Okay, thanks everybody. This is a great discussion. I have 2.5 questions, and so they're sort of unrelated, but they came into my mind listening to the discussion. The first one we haven't talked about yet, which is we had the CISA bill about going on 1.5 years ago about information sharing, and I don't think that the result has been what people on the Hill expected. I don't think that the government resources, to put it mildly, the government resources and the information the government can bring is not really being used by the private sector, and I wonder whether there's a way to improve that. Like, what can, besides the NIST framework, which is a public-private partnership, what can government do to help incentives, help the private sector sort of bring, information sharing is maybe one step that is maybe not so dramatic, but is there more steps that can be taken? So that first one is information sharing. From the point of view of vendors, internet infrastructure, DNS, and insurance. Like what kind of information could be shared to help that? The second one is about liability, and we touched on that briefly in the context of IoT liability. But more broadly, if you're a producer of anything, right, there's this concept of tort, right, civil harm caused by neglect. And for a variety of reasons, I mean, if you're in the C-suite and you're producing something, that's an incentive not to get out there and ship a defective product, right? Well, the software industry has always been exempt from that for a lot of historical reasons. We can talk about them. There's stuff out there on that. But as the damages and the claim and the claims and the damage caused, the harm caused by defective software increases, is it time to look at that? And obviously, the individual players in the market don't want to be held liable because they never have been. But is it time to look at maybe at a cap, some sort of way that isn't onerous, to sort of bake liability into the system? In other words, again, from the point of view of the vendors, from the internet infrastructure, DNS, and from insurance, how would you like to see some liability for some vendors who, this whole culture of ship it and then patch it later, right? At a minimum, if they had to rethink that, they could reduce some of these zero-day liabilities if there was a way to do that in some way that was not onerous for the system, yeah. And the final question, the half question, is for Aarti, which is about claims and payouts. I know you can't talk about individual clients. I know there's very skimpy data so far. But what percentage of people who buy policies end up making a claim? And of the claims you get, can you do this in very general terms? What's the main kind of claim you get? Is it, is data theft? Is it, ransomware? Is it, stoppage of, what is it? What is the basic picture emerging of how this insurance market works? Thanks.
So let's start with the first question, info sharing. It's a question, it's something I worked on a lot of, but I know other folks have views on info sharing. Tom, why don't we start with you, just on general on, what we've seen with info sharing pre and post CISA, and your take and McAfee's take on it.
Well, let's not forget how hard it was to pass CISA. The fact that it got done, the fact that DHS is standing up quite successfully an automated indicator sharing system. It's not where it needs to be yet, but a lot of progress has been made. The fact that we found consensus between the national security types, civil society, other stakeholders, this is something that we should remember was a hard-fought thing and merits praise. More needs to be done, right? On the matter of incentives, there are a couple bills on the Hill right now that would give accelerated tax credits for organizations that join information sharing organizations. That can help. Beyond that, we think that more work needs to be on updating CISA. Right now, they're just working on indicators of compromise. There's far richer data sets that could be looked at that could add a much more robust security environment. And we think that could be a CISA 2.0, but again, you get into deeper privacy concerns when you do that. So I think it'll take, a couple of years for consensus to develop to make that adjustment. But I think those are two areas where further progress can be made.
I mean, I'll just follow up on that point to say info sharing, I think, is an important piece of coming up with solutions. It has never been the full answer. A lot of people on the Hill sold it as the full answer, and that was a huge mistake on their part. At the time, I think we were pretty strong when I was at the White House to say to people, we're doing 7 or 8 different things. The framework is part of it. Information sharing is part of it. Working with critical infrastructure and getting them more ready in each individual individual sectors is part of it. Working with the sector-specific agencies to do that. So that's all part. Those are all pieces. There's definitely more info sharing today than there was in the past. In some ways, because of the way that some of the new threats have come around, info sharing might be less important than it was even at the time that CISA passed, because the churn on the types of threats that we see is greater. So sharing an indicator doesn't mean as much today as it did 3 or 4 years ago, but it's still important to do, and it still catches stuff, and we need to continue to improve it. So I think it is still really valuable to do. I think, there are companies that we're never going to share information, and passing CISA does not require them to do so. But there are a lot of companies that today are sharing that we're not sharing before. I think it has helped to build more information sharing organizations which is a positive thing. In the bill that we put forward, the last bill in the White House, it was that we try to push more of it towards information sharing organizations. I think that's still a good idea. So I like the idea that, Tom raising that, I think is positive. I think we need to promote information sharing organizations more to see more success in that space. There is some of that going on with the ISO work continuing, but we need to do more of that going forward. And I think you see some of that even in the draft EOs that we've seen from the Trump administration. So I'm hopeful in that space. Anyone else on info sharing? How about some of the info sharing that's going on among insurance companies?
Right. So I think I just spoke a little bit about some data aggregators that are working in the insurance space, and every year there seems to be a little bit more involvement. So you'll see maybe more carriers or more brokers participating. In terms of we were speaking about this earlier, but there has been some buzz about the government requiring insurance companies to share their data and to share data, regarding breaches. I don't know how well that will go over with an insurance company, and if the incentive is just to be able to get then actuarial data and claims data that they can use, that might incentivize them. At this point, they hold on to their data so tightly that it's already a challenge to get them to share
Don't
it.
some of them, you worked for insurers, so you would know, don't some of the states already require them to share some of that data?
Yeah, some
So-
do, and they're so heavily anonymized and sanitized that sometimes their value is, when they're sharing with the states, they have to give more exact information. But I don't know that that's going out into any form that then becomes, if the states give them information back, or if it's something that they're just required to do, or if it's something that they get a benefit from, like an incentive from.
So you have a question on this point, or? Because we still have software liability and claims data to.
The software liability issue's going to need to be resolved with alcohol. So I'm going to go back to the issue around sharing, because I think there's a lot of confusion about what is actually shared and the value of what's shared. And I think there is, from the private sector perspective, it's good to have the liability issues for sharing resolved through the legislation. But the sharing is not the point. The point is to take action afterwards. And so for something that I think has only come to mind in the last couple of months, but for the insurance industry to consider, so the Cyber Threat Alliance is the top cybersecurity companies coming together to share that information in a way that enables them to provide better products and services. So if insurance companies, when they're doing the analysis of a potential customer, can look to see whether the entities, vendors that they're working with are using products from that entity that's participating in the alliance, because then you know that that particular company, I'm not going to say anyone in particular, has better information and so what it does is it gives you a little bit more confidence that the security posture that you have is enhanced by having better data. And the Cyber Threat Alliance model is not just, okay, I'm going to join that. They're actually validating the value of what it is that you're sharing with an algorithm, which nobody, because everybody likes to be a part of these groups to share, but it's not sharing equally all the time in terms of amount and quality. So I throw that out there because even though and my teenage daughter will vouch for this, more on the stick than the carrot side, that instead of talking about just incentives, you have to also talk about things that you have to do from a regulatory perspective. I think giving credit to companies who are doing good security things beyond hygiene is important. So I throw that out there because information sharing, people are confused about what that means. There's a difference between the insurance folks sharing as required with their state insurance commissioner and regulator information about what's going on, because that's part of the regulatory environment in the insurance sector, which unfortunately is state by state, so it has a layer of complexity, versus the threat indicators that the ISALs and ISACs and the Cyber Threat Alliance does. So I wanted to make that distinction.
Yeah.
And to say
No,
that
incident information is different than threat information. Obviously, that's a very good point. And I don't know, do you have any thoughts on the idea of, either Tom or Aarti have thoughts on the idea of whether it's, the idea of giving a benefit from to being something like a member of CTA or FSISAC, or where they're getting the real threat information?
I think from a carrier perspective, I mean, most of the vendors that they use are heavily vetted. I've been in the process of kicking them off, bringing someone else in. But I think that, to your point, this would be another, like even just to get on the panel, because there's so much, the volume is so high at some of the, the 5 or 6 biggest carriers that are dealing with, cyber policies, that if you're a vendor who has an agreement with that carrier and you're being basically recommended or on their panel, that's not an easy spot to get. So something like this type of accreditation would just go further in, in having, in the carrier being able to give an endorsement basically for those vendors.
Well, on the matter of CTA, the Cyber Threat Alliance, it's good of you to bring up that organization. So the big objective of CTA was to get over really an incentive problem, and that was the incentive challenge of being a free rider. In our industry, everyone wants the cyber threat data, but oftentimes there's been historically a reluctance to share the threat indicator data with others in the industry. So, not to paint a bleak picture, for years, there's been quite a lot of sharing among cyber companies, for sure. But the real objective of CTA was to directly get at the free rider issue, get companies bound together, in effect create an MOU amongst the companies to share threat information for the good of all. The CTA, I think, has been around, a year and a half or so. We've just hired our executive director. We're making good progress. The ambition is to grow the alliance, add more members, create more robust information sharing among members, and then likewise over time with the government. So, I see this as a very good trend line relative to progress.
Thanks. So let's move on to the software liability question. Olaf, since you haven't spoken in a while, why don't you?
I'm still trying to internalize the whole sharing discussion, because there's a global component, and seeing these things clutter within, or essentially domestic or national organization makes me worried a bit. Although I understand what the incentive models are there and the trust models that create those initiatives.
I would say CTA has some international members now.
Okay.
They didn't originally, but now they've added several international members. I cannot remember which telecoms, European telecoms just joined, but
that's why I kept my mouth shut,
Yeah.
because I don't know enough about this topic.
Yeah.
Anyway,
But
you were saying
the point about DHS. It's important for the point about DHS automated indicator sharing. The international component is a good. It's a good
and
point.
there's standards activities around that I know of.
Right.
How do you do the sharing on a semantic level and so
Exactly.
on. Yeah, right. Anyway, you were saying that the liability might help with zero-day disclosure, or addressing zero-day, and I think that's probably not correct. The 0 days are things that you don't know of. You cannot fix or be held liable for something you don't know of. What I do think is that we need to get to a norm where we accept that if there are bugs around that have been around for quite some time, and frankly, most of the bugs that are used, I think you can confirm that, most of the bugs that are used to actually break and enter are bugs that have been around for ages.
Depending how you count, it's between 80 and 99.9%, right? So it's like 80 if you say there's one thing in this whole exploit, right, that was never been seen before. It's at 80. But if you count, you needed to go through steps 3, 4, and 5, which have all been seen before, in order to do step 6, which is the new thing, right, then it's 99.9%, right? Like almost every attack is in order to has to be, yeah, exactly.
So I think that is where that liability question might come in. If there is a norm that accepts that, if there's known stuff out there and it's been there for years, why isn't this fixed? I think that is the moment where tort and liability questions might come in. But I do think that you need to have a societal norm around that first, because otherwise, juries will probably not say, we understand this. That whole system, again, I think once you are at the end of that value chain, there might be questions around how does that interact with open source? Because most of the at least in the consumer industry, I would say most of the supply chain there is based on open source. SSL, DNS, IP, all these stacks, the whole Linux kernel is essentially open source with waived liability. So how do you address that? I think that has to do with ultimately the manufacturer taking responsibility for upgradability, for making sure that there is a reporting infrastructure, responsible vulnerability reporting infrastructure in place, and so on and so forth, so that at least once those things are in place, I think you get to a place where a manufacturer might actually be able to defend itself for downstream bugs that are still existing.
I think the idea isn't to have the trial lawyers chasing after the software vendors. It's to have the software vendors understand that they could be sued, to take a little more care in introducing new products or that kind of thing.
Well, I think that usually the software vendors are, if I look at the open source, they're pretty responsive. If there is a heartbleed, was fixed in no time. But it's really upstream where things become complicated. Somebody who is not in the business of doing IT, who needs a stack on a play doh, they will go to the market and might get themselves something that is years and years old and not upgradable. And I think that is where the real issue is.
Tom, do you have a response on software liability? You're both software makers and security people.
Well, look, the big thing about the software sector is that our product life cycles are really, really rapid, and there's a lot of competition. So I think if you impose that kind of, liability, you may indeed increase security, but there's also the question of the trade-off of what does that potentially do to innovation. Does that push out your product life cycles from 3-6 months, even real time more and more, out to a more traditional kind of time frame of 18 or 24 months? And, what does that do for consumer satisfaction? So, I think there's a balance that policymakers really need to consider.
So, we still have this. Yeah, go ahead.
And another aspect, like these things are being updated for 6 months or so after they shipped, and after that it's done. The people who do the product updates are moved to a different product, and these things are not maintained anymore. I think that's the same with other consumer products. So freeing up those developers to not do the security stuff elsewhere will, if you have to put them on the product, keep them on the product, innovation speed goes down. So yeah.
David's on this point.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
It seems that in terms of liability and in terms of the IoT, one of the big gaps is in accountability and attribution.
Yes.
And if those were more clear, there'd be more incentives for people to buy insurance. How could something like, and it seems like in the corporate environment you described, it's less fluid than the hacker environment. Those things aren't really as fluid as they would be.
When you say attribution of the attacker or attribution of the supply chain?
Attribution in general, in terms of if there's a cyber breach, right? You want to know who the attacker is, you want to know what the vector is, you want to know what the vulnerabilities were that allowed the attacker to attack. information, and it seems like they're not as fluid. And it seems like there's not as much accountability, thorough accountability in attacks. And it seems like that gap would lead to less incentives for people to be proactive.
I'm trying to understand if there's a question in there.
How could markets or policy increase accountability that would lead to greater incentives for people to mitigate vulnerabilities? Would you agree that there's, that markets and organizations are slower to,
So if it comes to accountability, I'm thinking GDPR, GDPR, sorry, the privacy regulation from Europe. Are you thinking about that type of accountability, where if there's a data breach, it'll cost you?
or it'll be known, or the people responsible will be known. And there's more knowledge about what happened and more consequences.
I mean, from an insurance perspective, basically, if it's a third-party complaint, it's based on the allegation. So unless there's there's a lot of exclusions to the policy, but a malicious or intentional act, the accountability may not ever be determined, but insurance might pay anyway, right? So I don't know how much of a factor it is, again, unless it's like a rogue act or an intentional act from an insurance perspective, because, they're not, unless it's litigated and it comes out, it's not something that insurance is necessarily looking to, right?
You want to follow, get to your claims question, or?
No, it was more about let's two very we can't talk about specific clients, you know that, but of the of the entities who bought cyber insurance in the past, 5 years, what percent have actually had a claim or a payout? Is it 80%? Is it 10%? And of those payouts, what's the most common payout? What type of it?
So I think it's shifted. I can't answer your first question just because I don't know. The second, I would say right now, ransomware is very popular because it's relatively easy to do. There's a lot of claims that go unreported. Depending on the revenue band, industry class, et cetera, of client, you may have $1 million, $5 million, $20 million retention. So again, if there's, the probability or possibility that, I talk to clients all the time that have $1 million retentions and a $7,000 ransomware payoff, and they're not going to report it, right? So
do insurers cover the ransomware payout?
Yes.
They do?
yes,
Do
they do.
they cover if you have business loss insurance, if you decide not to pay it, will they cover the?
No.
So they're basically incentivizing people to pay off the ransom.
They do, and the first question is, do you have a backup? And the amounts tend to be smaller, and they tend to be sort of random, 13,000. They're paid in Bitcoin. There's some, I guess there's an honor among thieves that if you paid a ransomware to someone once and that they'll let your systems go after you pay it, and then they go to the next person and they do the same thing, and it's a bit strange. But ransomware, like I said, I think it seems to be, we always use the kids in their basement thing that seems to be the trigger. We have seen ransomware attacks by states and by bigger actors, and some that I think are particularly troubling are ransomware attacks against hospitals. And you can imagine, waiting for a surgery, all your information is tied up. That there's some, like I said, that have taken a more disturbing trend. I'm looking at my insurance coverages here. Business interruption, we've seen some claims. I think what's preventing us from seeing more are the waiting periods. And what is a waiting period? It's how long your system has to be down before insurance will pay. 6 to 12 hours is the average in a cyber policy. We see anywhere in that range. A lot of people don't make it that whole time because, frankly, their systems need to be up. They have backups, they have whatever. 6 to 12 hours, if your system is based on your network, is a long time. So we're trying to push those down. We've been sort of successful, but there has to be, I think, theoretically, at least carriers believe some sort of waiting period. Breaches, as I mentioned before, they happen in varied amounts. The average breach costs about $4 million, again, depending on your retention point, depending on number of records. I would say that the cost that hikes up breaches from a first-party perspective are PCI, payment card industry assessments. Those are covered under insurance policies traditionally, and they can range anywhere from a couple of dollars per card to $50, $60 per card. So that's another thing you see. And then again, just because you have a data breach, it doesn't mean that you'll have a third party, you'll have third party claims, but you may have regulatory claims that are also covered under insurance policies. But the standard breach response is, a coach, notification, credit monitoring, crisis management, call centers. Those are little variation among the top 5 or 6 cyber policies.
Can I just ask if I heard you correctly? Did you say that your policy would cover the payment of the ransom, but not the business losses associated with a refusal?
It's not her policy. She's a broker.
I understand, but the policies that they're vending would, but not the business losses associated with a refusal to pay the ransom.
So it depends. Usually, so it's called cyber extortion is usually the term in a policy. Now, cyber extortion can be paired with business interruption or something else. If the trigger, there are 2 triggers in an insurance policy for business interruption. One is a security incident. If the security incident is a hack, a DDoS, right, network security failure, privacy failure, it usually will not include a cyber extortion. And the second is system failure, which again, there's been some hesitation in the markets to accept. That's, we always give the same example. The janitor, is sweeping and unplugs the plug to your whole system, and it's just an unplanned outage. Something happened. So that is the other trigger that not all markets accept, but that's the
Or
other
if you're
trigger.
if you're the I think it was NASDAQ, a rat eats through your wires.
You'd be amazed what system failure can encompass. But that's the second trigger usually for business interruption. And sometimes because it's less predictable, the waiting hours period is longer.
I had a question. We're kicking around the terms like accountability and regulation as far as the commercial side of the house goes, but how do we hold the government accountable? We've had school systems that were hacked, Office of Personnel Management. My mom joined the Air Force in 1979, and her information was compromised. I joined in 2000, and my information was also compromised. So if you're talking about the scope of information over the course of a period, that's pretty absurd. But
Oh, I love doing this in Washington. How many people in this room have got the OPM notice?
Exactly.
Oh my!
Exactly.
So, Tom, you're probably the most, you follow this most closely, so.
So the question of accountability within organizations, look, I think a really timely way to look at this question is the draft executive order from the Trump administration. Draft number 2 that we've all seen puts a great deal of focus on the importance of having cybersecurity accountability put right at the top of each organization, right, with secretaries of departments, with the head of OMB, and then flowing through organizations. That's exactly the right place to put it. Likewise, in organizations, we're seeing more and more boards getting a lot more focused on cyber. We're seeing more boards put at least one person with cyber expertise, in the seat of the board membership, such that you get more accountability. So it has to start at the top, and you have to drive it bottom down. But obviously, there's a lot more work that needs to be done.
That sort of is counterintuitive given the report you just cited.
Well, you're right. It is to some degree. I mean, I think what we see in organizations that are healthy, you see the best of both worlds. You see accountability, you see leadership, you see the buck stopping at the top, but you also see the right processes organization-wide, such that middle management operators are properly aligned, they're properly compensated, And, you know, most organizations that are top of class in terms of capability tend to have, really always have, holistic programs from top to bottom that produce real value. And, you know, that's absolutely what's needed. So it's creating the linkages between leadership and accountability and incentives organization-wide, which will tend to get you the better outcomes.
So, I mean, I'd like to answer this one too, because this is something I really have put a lot of time into and I care about a lot. To me, and the reason I agree with Tom that the executive orders, the draft executive order that we saw, we'll see if it still continues down this path, but the draft that we saw, it heads in the right direction, is because you have to make it the mission of the government agency as early on as possible into when the leadership joins. Because the problem is, if the agency's mission is, let's say you're talking about the Department of Interior, if the person coming in sees their mission as, you know, protecting public land and making sure that, you know, people going to visit it have good experiences, etc. Cybersecurity is something that is a external factor that needs to be addressed in order to make those other things work, right? If cybersecurity is part of the mission, right, from the beginning, then it's something that gets measured, it's something that they put budget towards right away, and it's not something that gets pulled off of. It is not, in other words, it is not something that is a drain on other mission activities. It is a mission activity itself. So it's important to make that happen up front. Otherwise, when they're coming up with what we're going to do, cybersecurity gets added on later on, and it's always going to be a drain, as opposed to for governments where, you know, they're in the business of maintaining information. Cybersecurity could be part of the mission from the beginning for pretty much every agency.
That's in alignment to what we just talked about
Yeah.
in terms of the consumer space, where when you were in the business of making fridges, you are not in the business of IT security. And that's the big change that the world is going through now.
Right.
So that there's a symmetry there. Yeah.
It's a good point, Aarti.
Other questions? We'll do these last two and then.
Mike Nelson with Cloudflare. Ari, I was really interested in your question about an hour ago on whether the NIST security framework needs to devote more attention to the Internet of Things. I wanted to add to that question and say, does it also need to pay more attention to ways we can use the cloud to provide better security? A lot of the framework, a lot of the other frameworks that Olaf mentioned, they all seem to imply that I'm going to buy a box for my network, or I'm going to put some software on my own system. I mean, this is a self-interested question. But
I also asked, told Aarti this too, which was, I filled out an insurance form not so long ago for one client, and the first question, one of the only 3 questions on it was, are you running antivirus software on your systems, right? If you're in the cloud, I mean, the cloud company is for you, but you're not running it
Let's hope
yourself.
so.
So your answer is no, right? I mean, you have to answer no. And that doesn't even make a difference in how you get insurance or not. Like, it's not, the idea of being in the cloud is not even like thought of in the insurance space at all. So not to pull back to insurance, but just to make that.
And this does lead to a more general question, which is, how do you deal with cybersecurity regulations that were written 15 years ago?
Yeah.
Often they have like 10% of the tools that we use now. So Olaf, what were you nodding
Yeah,
about?
well, no, I think actually that in terms of some of these frameworks, I do think they address the cloud and the realization that a lot of the data that is gathered by the sensors that make up Internet of Things end up in the cloud, somewhere out of the control of the sensor itself, or even a user. I might be wrong here, but I do think that these type of again, this comes back to taking a proactive security stance and thinking about what are actually the things that I need to do when I put out a sensor, I collect private or personal data, and I store it somewhere. I always say the cloud is basically somebody else's computer. what do I need to do if I store data on somebody else's computer? Encryption. How do I maintain that? What do I do when it got breached? Do I have the breach notifications in place? Do I have the contacts in place? Do I have the information sharing in place? So it's that type of mindset that is needed. And I don't know the details of the NIST framework and whether that's being addressed. But again, it's not about the compliance; it's about the mindset.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing within this framework is it's a risk management framework, as this man over here said earlier, right? It's not a compliance framework. So if it's as a risk, you have different risks in the cloud. You need to take that into account as you use the framework, and some of that is addressed in the intro to the framework. I mean, where it basically says if you use the cloud, you need to look at this differently.
Some of the risks that they identify are different than the risks that you would identify if you were living in a cloud
What I don't know is
environment.
if anyone has done a profile for the cloud, right?
Yeah.
Here's the stuff you need to do for the cloud, which would be a great project for,
For you and me to work on.
Yeah. we're doing profiles in other areas. Now that people are doing it, let's do it.
But just to get back to Olaf's point, we do have to worry about people on the Hill who are writing regulations that are just completely devoid of any realization that the cloud is part of the solution of securing the Internet of Things.
That's the big risk of regulation in general. You're regulating for today and not for tomorrow. With yesterday, right. I think that is the big risk. I think it's a tool in the tool bag, but use it very, very carefully. Yeah.
Final question here.
Oh, sorry, that's pressure. On the issue of government accountability, how do you think of policies in place that the government are using that could possibly actively work against network security? And because Aari's on the panel, I just have to ask about what do you view processes like VEP reform in this debate?
You meaning that is a separate question or related to things that work against security?
I'll just say as part of the general discussion, not actively working against.
So, well, I don't know if you want to talk about the balance. Anyone here wants to talk about balance of, or I should take that on. I'm going to want to pick up the. I'll do it first.
You go first, then I'll go.
So let me start with VEP, and then I'll go into the other question. So, I mean, I think the fact we are hearing that VEP is still going forward in the new administration, which is good. So this is the vulnerability equities process, which is part of what the government does when it finds a vulnerability, and in the process it goes by which it makes decisions about whether it's going to disclose it to the vendor that had the vulnerability or not. I think it's interesting in the context of the software liability question, which is you give these software these vulnerabilities over to industry, and industry doesn't have to necessarily do anything with it, right? So we don't know the whole process of whether the companies have acted on it or not. If the government turns over something to them, or some researcher turns something over to them, I think in terms of the conversation here, there is this question about whether they take an action. And then there's another step to it too, which is we also know the biggest weakness is actually people aren't patching, right? The reason that you have 99.9% of incidents that happen where they're based on some kind of known vulnerability is because people haven't patched that vulnerability, right? Or taken steps to prevent it as the controls say you should. So it's like one step in a long chain, right? The vulnerability disclosure piece of it is one step in a really long chain of making a difference. So there are people out there who've worked in the intelligence community in particular who say, this is the VEP is a sideshow. It's not, not really that helpful for security. We're talking about very few numbers of real actual vulnerabilities being patched, and when they do, people don't act on it. That's true. But on the other side of it, it is, the way we're going to get better at this is if we fix vulnerabilities faster. We start to get to the point of being able to automate fixing vulnerabilities, and then people actually patch them, and we automate the patching too. We have all that becomes automated. We're going to be in a much better space. That's not today's world, but it could be the world in the future, and so we have to start moving down that path to get there. I think VEP demonstrates that the government understands that worldview, right? And I think that's a positive thing. So that's my kind of very, very internet society view of why you should be supportive of VEP. And then in terms of this question on things that work against security, I mean, there's always this balance of, I put it as convenience, right? Doing things for convenience sake, doing things for privacy, and doing things for security. Sometimes, very rarely, all three of those things align, right? Sometimes privacy, most of the time cybersecurity and privacy align, actually, 90%, but there's sometimes where they're diametrically opposed. And a lot of times convenience and security or convenience and privacy are diametrically opposed. But you got to get to the balance point where those are the right things. And I think from a government perspective in particular, but for companies too, right? Citizens or customers in the company space expect you to be able to do all three. So the question is, how do we get to the best balance of those three things where we're doing all three of them at the same time and coming up with the best answer? That's not all. You're not always going to be able to pick, something that falls dead center and solves every problem. You're always going to have to give a little bit on one side or the other. Obviously, security is becoming a lot more important in that discussion. That goes to what I was saying before about, that we just don't. We're not at the level of trust that we used to be at here. You have to take security more seriously than you did in the past.
Well, I think we're closing off now. So let me make a little quip. I mean, either is a cup half full or is it half empty? I mean, look, here's the big thing to remember. And when I see Mike Nelson here in the audience, I remember that you had worked for then Senator Gore on some of the original ideas supporting the growth of the internet, right? And then you'd worked in the Clinton White House. And when I go back to Sun Microsystems, back then, some 20 years ago, the question on the table was, would the internet be based on open interfaces or not? It was also a question of, would the internet actually produce digital commerce? So now you fast forward 20 years, and you've seen this incredible growth of the internet economy, right? Trillions of dollars are being transacted on the internet. It's being used in ways that no one had predicted. Look at Khan Academy. People 15 years ago were thinking about how do you do education online, and so much innovation has occurred. So here's what I would say. All that innovation, even though security hasn't been always up to snuff, I think was still worth it. There's a need now to catch up, but we're really only 20 years into this cycle. There's a lot of progress still yet to be made, and if the rate of innovation that we've seen in the last 20 years continues and speeds up, particularly on the matters of security and privacy, I think we're going to see a very, very full cup at the end of the day.
Final words from either of you two? A little over time, but.
No, actually, those are perfect last words.
Great.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Except that if you ask a physics person, it's the cup half full. Water? Air.